Picture this. You're walking through the city on an ordinary Tuesday evening when you hear the sound of quiet sobbing coming from behind a luxury car. You approach cautiously, and there she is, a young woman in an expensive dress, tears streaming down her face as she clutches her phone with trembling hands. Most people would walk past, mind their own business. But what if that moment of human compassion changed not just her life but yours and your child's forever? What if that stranger's whispered secret became the key to healing wounds you didn't even know existed? This is exactly what happened to Jake Thompson, a single father whose simple act of kindness unlocked a story of love, loss, and the incredible power of chosen family that will leave you believing in miracles again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Thompson had learned to measure his days in coffee spoons and bedtime stories. At 32, his hands bore the permanent stains of engine oil and determination, evidence of 14-hour shifts at Morrison's Auto Repair that barely kept their small apartment above water. The smell of motor oil had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, a constant reminder that survival required sacrifice. Every morning he would wake at 5:30, brew coffee in a pot that had seen better decades, and prepare breakfast for the most important person in his world. 7-year-old Tommy Thompson possessed his mother's bright green eyes and an infectious laugh that could light up the darkest corners of their modest two-bedroom apartment. Jake often caught himself staring at his son, seeing glimpses of Maria in the way Tommy scrunched his nose when concentrating, or how he hummed while coloring. Maria had been gone for 3 years now, taken by cancer that had moved through her body like wildfire, leaving Jake to navigate single parenthood with nothing but love and stubborn determination. Their neighborhood wasn't the safest or the prettiest, but it was home. The apartment walls were thin enough to hear Mrs. Chen's television through the plaster, and the heating system had moods of its own, but Jake had painted murals on Tommy's bedroom walls during sleepless nights, creating a fantasy world where anything seemed possible. He had taught himself to braid hair through YouTube videos, learned to cook more than just scrambled eggs, and discovered that bedtime stories required different voices for different characters. The auto shop where Jake worked sat in the industrial district, a place where dreams came to die beneath fluorescent lights and the constant hum of machinery. His coworkers were good men who understood that family came first, even when paychecks came last. Jake's boss, old Pete Morrison, had a soft spot for single fathers and often let Jake bring Tommy to the shop during school holidays, where the boy would sit in the corner with his coloring books, fascinated by the mechanical ballet of car repairs. Money was always tight, stretched thinner than the worn-out brake pads Jake replaced daily. Jake had perfected the art of making $30 last a week for groceries, of finding joy in library books instead of movie theaters, and of explaining to Tommy why other kids had things they couldn't afford without making his son feel less worthy. Every penny was accounted for, every expense weighed against necessity, but somehow Jake always managed to make Tommy's birthdays special, with homemade cakes and treasure hunts around their neighborhood. The city's wealthy district might as well have been another planet to Jake Thompson. He drove through it sometimes on service calls, fixing expensive cars for people who spent more on lunch than he made in a day, but he never lingered. Those gleaming office buildings and manicured parks represented a world that existed parallel to his own, close enough to see, but too far to touch. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He taught Tommy that wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the richness of love, laughter, and the strength to keep going when everything felt impossible. What Jake didn't know was that 15 miles away, in a penthouse office that overlooked the very neighborhood where he struggled to make ends meet, another broken soul was learning that all the money in the world couldn't buy the one thing she desperately needed. 24-year-old Sophia Williams had never learned how to cry quietly. In the corporate world, her father had built around her like a fortress. Tears were seen as weakness, vulnerability as currency that others could exploit. But sitting in the driver's seat of her silver Mercedes in the parking lot of Riverside Memorial Hospital, she couldn't stop the sobs that racked her entire body. The medical report, clutched in her trembling hands, felt like a death sentence written in clinical terminology and statistical probabilities. The Williams empire stretched across 3 states. a pharmaceutical conglomerate that her father Marcus had built from a single drugstore into a billion-dollar corporation. Sophia had grown up in boardrooms instead of playgrounds, learning to read profit margins before she could properly read picture books. Her childhood had been a series of nannies, private tutors, and boarding schools designed to mold her into the perfect corporate heir. But perfection, she had discovered, was a mask that eventually cracked under pressure. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty at 8 in the evening, most visitors having returned to their normal lives, while she remained trapped in a nightmare that money couldn't solve. Dr. Henderson's words echoed in her mind like a broken record playing the same devastating song. The headaches that had been plaguing her for months weren't stress-related, as she had hoped. The dizzy spells, the blurred vision, the moments of confusion weren't signs of exhaustion from 18-hour workdays. The brain tumor sitting behind her left temple was inoperable, aggressive, and according to the best specialists money could buy, would give her perhaps 18 months to live. Sophia had always believed that wealth was armor against life's cruelest jokes. Her father had taught her that money was power, that power was protection, that the Williams name could open any door and solve any problem. But sitting alone in a hospital parking lot with a diagnosis that billions of dollars couldn't change, she felt more powerless than any homeless person begging for change on the streets her father's limousines glided past without stopping. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was dying in the parking lot of a hospital her family's foundation had funded. The Williams name was etched in gold letters above the entrance to the Cancer Research Wing, a monument to her father's tax-deductible compassion. She had attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony 5 years ago, smiling for cameras while inwardly counting the minutes until she could escape back to her climate-controlled office where human suffering was reduced to quarterly charity reports. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from her father's assistant, reminders about board meetings and merger discussions that now seemed absurdly trivial. Tomorrow morning, she was supposed to present the quarterly financials to investors who would measure her worth in percentage points and profit margins. Next week, she had a date with Harrison Blackwell, the son of another pharmaceutical dynasty, a union her father had orchestrated like a business acquisition. The thought of pretending to care about stock options and strategic partnerships when she might not live to see Christmas made her laugh through her tears, a sound so bitter it surprised her. The medical report detailed treatment options that read like torture methods disguised as hope, chemotherapy that would leave her bald and nauseated, radiation that might buy her a few extra months at the cost of her cognitive function, experimental treatments that had failed 90% of previous patients. Dr. Henderson had delivered this information with the practiced detachment of someone who had learned to separate himself from the human cost of medical realities. Sophia had always prided herself on being logical, analytical, capable of making tough decisions without emotional interference. But logic felt useless when faced with her own mortality. She thought about all the experiences she had sacrificed for corporate success, all the relationships she had avoided because they didn't serve her father's vision for her future. She had never learned to drive anything but luxury cars, never lived anywhere but penthouse apartments, never loved anyone who wasn't pre-approved by corporate lawyers and background investigators. The parking lot security lights flickered on as darkness settled over the city, casting long shadows between the rows of cars. Sophia watched through her windshield as a small pickup truck pulled into a space 3 rows away. A man in work clothes emerged from the driver's side, moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying invisible weight. From the passenger side, a young boy with messy brown hair bounced out, clutching a handmade get-well card decorated with crayon drawings of flowers and stick figures. Jake Thompson had spent the last hour in the pediatric ward with Tommy, visiting Mrs. Rodriguez from their apartment building. The elderly woman had been like a grandmother to Tommy since Maria's death, babysitting when Jake worked late shifts and teaching the boy to make her famous empanadas on weekends. When she had been admitted for pneumonia, Tommy had insisted on making her a card and bringing her the plastic dinosaur that usually guarded his bedside table. The visit had been bittersweet, watching Tommy's innocent faith that love and dinosaurs could cure anything, while Jake worried about medical bills Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't afford and the possibility of losing another person who had become family. He had promised to check on her cat and water her plants, small gestures that felt inadequate against the magnitude of illness and aging, but were all he had to offer. Tommy chattered excitedly about Mrs. Rodriguez's promise to teach him to make flan when she got better, his 7-year-old optimism a stark contrast to Jake's adult understanding of how fragile health could be. They had spent the drive from the hospital discussing what kind of soup would help Mrs. Rodriguez feel stronger, Tommy suggesting everything from chicken noodle to ice cream soup, which he insisted was a real thing he had invented. As they walked through the parking lot toward their truck, Tommy's keen eyes noticed the woman sitting alone in the expensive car. His mother had taught him to notice when people were sad, and even at 7 he possessed an intuitive understanding of human pain that often surprised adults. Maria had always said that kindness was free but priceless, a lesson that had taken root in Tommy's generous heart. The sound of crying carried across the quiet parking lot, soft but unmistakable in the evening air. Tommy stopped walking and tugged on Jake's work jacket, pointing toward the silver Mercedes where Sophia sat with her head in her hands. Jake followed his son's gaze and saw what looked like a young woman in distress, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. Every instinct Jake had developed as a father told him to approach carefully. Crying strangers in hospital parking lots usually meant bad news, the kind of devastating diagnoses that turned normal people into hollow shells of themselves. He had been that person once, sitting in a different parking lot 3 years ago, struggling to process the words metastatic cancer and 6 months, while trying to figure out how to explain to a 4-year-old that mommy wasn't coming home. Tommy had already started walking toward the Mercedes before Jake could stop him, his small hand still clutching the extra get-well card he had made for Mrs. Rodriguez. The boy approached the driver's side window with the fearless compassion that only children possess, tapping gently on the glass with his knuckles. Sophia looked up through her tears to see a small face pressed against her window, wide green eyes filled with concern, and a gap-toothed smile that somehow managed to be both shy and encouraging. For a moment, she forgot about tumor cells and death sentences, startled by the unexpected appearance of this child who had materialized like a guardian angel in the gathering darkness. She rolled down her window slowly, unsure what to say to a 7-year-old who had witnessed her complete breakdown. Tommy held up his extra card, the one decorated with purple crayon flowers and a stick figure family holding hands under a yellow sun. "Are you okay, lady?" Tommy asked, with the direct honesty that adults had trained themselves to avoid. "You look really sad, and my dad says when people are sad in hospitals, sometimes they need a friend." Jake approached behind his son, ready to apologize for the interruption and guide Tommy away if the woman preferred privacy. But something in her expression stopped him, a look of such profound loneliness that it reminded him of his own reflection in the months after Maria's death. He recognized the particular brand of grief that came from facing mortality, the way it stripped away all pretense and left you raw and desperate for human connection. "I'm sorry," Jake said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to comforting frightened people. "My son has a gift for finding people who need kindness. We don't mean to intrude, but if you need someone to talk to or just sit with you for a while, we're here." Sophia stared at this man in oil-stained work clothes and his beautiful child, people from a world so different from hers they might have been from another planet. But in that moment, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of hospital air and the weight of her impossible future, they represented something she had never experienced but desperately needed. They offered her something money couldn't buy and status couldn't command, the simple gift of human compassion with no strings attached and no hidden agenda. She began, then stopped, unsure how to explain that she was crying because she was dying, that all her wealth and privilege had proven useless against the cellular rebellion growing in her brain. Instead, she looked at Tommy's earnest face and managed a weak smile. "Thank you for asking." "That's very kind of you." Tommy beamed at her response and held the card closer to her window. "This is for you. I made it for Mrs. Rodriguez, but I think you need it more. It has magic healing powers because I drew it with my special crayons." The absurdity of accepting a crayon drawing from a child as medical treatment should have struck Sophia as ridiculous, but instead, she found herself reaching for the card with trembling fingers. When was the last time someone had given her something without expecting anything in return? When had anyone offered her magic, even the innocent magic of childhood imagination? "What's your name?" she asked Tommy, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tommy Thompson, and this is my dad Jake. We live in the apartments by Morrison's auto shop." "What's your name?" "Sophia," she replied, leaving off the Williams surname that usually preceded any introduction. For the first time in her adult life, she wanted to be just Sophia, not the pharmaceutical heiress or the corporate princess, just a scared young woman accepting kindness from strangers. Jake watched this exchange with growing understanding. He recognized the expensive car, the designer clothes, the carefully styled hair that marked Sophia as someone from the wealthy district he occasionally serviced. But he also recognized the particular emptiness in her eyes, the way grief and fear could make even the most privileged person feel utterly alone in the world. "Sophia's a pretty name," Tommy announced with the diplomatic skills of a born negotiator. "Do you want to come have ice cream with us? Dad says ice cream helps when you're sad, and there's a place that has dinosaur sprinkles." The invitation was so unexpected, so genuinely innocent, that Sophia felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. Here was a child offering her dinosaur sprinkles as medicine for her broken soul, while the best doctors in the country could only offer her statistical probabilities and pharmaceutical protocols. The kindness was overwhelming in its simplicity. "I don't think I'd be very good company right now," Sophia admitted, though part of her desperately wanted to say yes, to follow these strangers to a place where dinosaur sprinkles could solve problems and kindness was offered without calculation. "That's okay," Tommy said with the wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate his own losses. "Dad wasn't good company for a long time after Mom died, but ice cream helped. And talking to people. And hugs, if you want hugs." The casual mention of death from such a young child, delivered without drama or self-pity, struck Sophia like a revelation. Here was a boy who had faced loss and somehow emerged with his capacity for joy intact, offering comfort to a stranger in a parking lot because it was simply the right thing to do. She looked at Jake, seeing in his gentle eyes the understanding of someone who had walked through his own valley of shadows and emerged with his humanity enhanced rather than diminished. The ice cream parlor that Tommy had enthusiastically recommended turned out to be a small, family-owned shop called Scoops and Dreams, wedged between a laundromat and a used bookstore in a neighborhood that Sophia had never known existed. The vinyl booths were patched with duct tape, the floors showed decades of wear, and the fluorescent light above their table flickered intermittently, casting everything in an uncertain glow that somehow felt more honest than the perfectly calibrated lighting in the restaurants she usually frequented. Sophia found herself sitting across from Jake and Tommy, a bowl of vanilla ice cream with rainbow sprinkles melting slowly in front of her while she watched this father and son navigate their evening routine with the practiced ease of two people who had learned to be everything to each other. Jake cut Tommy's hot fudge sundae into manageable bites while simultaneously listening to his son's detailed explanation of why dinosaur sprinkles were scientifically superior to regular sprinkles, occasionally catching drips before they could stain Tommy's already paint-splattered t-shirt. The normalcy of it was intoxicating. For the first time in months, Sophia wasn't thinking about quarterly projections or merger strategies, or the tumor growing behind her left temple. Instead, she was learning that Tommy collected bottle caps because they reminded him of tiny shields, that Jake had taught himself to braid hair by practicing on Tommy's stuffed animals, and that they had a tradition of making pancakes shaped like different states every Sunday morning, though Jake admitted his Texas looked more like a confused blob. Over the following weeks, what had begun as a chance encounter in a hospital parking lot evolved into something Sophia had never experienced, but found herself craving with an intensity that surprised her. Jake would text her after his shifts at the auto shop, simple messages asking how her day had been, or sharing pictures of Tommy's latest artistic creations. These weren't the calculated communications of her business world, where every word was weighed for strategic advantage, but genuine expressions of care from people who seemed to find her worth knowing just as she was. Tommy had appointed himself as Sophia's official friend and took this responsibility with the seriousness of a diplomatic appointment. He would call her on Jake's phone every few days to share important updates about his day, his voice bubbling with excitement as he described the caterpillar he had found in the apartment building's courtyard or the new joke Mrs. Chen had taught him. These conversations became the highlights of Sophia's increasingly difficult days, islands of pure joy in an ocean of medical appointments and corporate obligations. The brain tumor was progressing exactly as Dr. Henderson had predicted, bringing with it a constellation of symptoms that Sophia struggled to hide from her father and his constantly watchful staff. The headaches had intensified, sharp spikes of pain that would leave her gripping the edges of conference tables while trying to maintain her composure during board meetings. The dizzy spells came without warning, forcing her to learn the location of every chair and wall in the Williams Industries building so she could steady herself without appearing weak. But the most frightening symptom was the way words would sometimes disappear from her vocabulary mid-sentence, leaving her grasping for concepts that had been second nature just moments before. During a presentation to potential investors, she had stood at the front of the boardroom, PowerPoint clicker in hand, completely unable to remember the word pharmaceutical. She had covered the moment by taking a sip of water and rephrasing, but the incident had left her shaken and hyper-aware of every verbal stumble. Jake began to notice changes in Sophia that she thought she was hiding successfully. The way she would press her fingers to her temples during their conversations, the careful way she moved as if afraid of losing her balance, the moments when she would pause mid-sentence with a look of confusion that seemed disproportionate to their casual discussions. His experience caring for Maria during her illness had made him sensitive to the signs of someone fighting a battle they couldn't discuss. One afternoon, while they sat in Central Park watching Tommy feed ducks with the intense concentration of a wildlife researcher, Sophia finally found the courage to share her secret. The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like water through a broken dam. She told Jake about the tumor, about the 18-month prognosis, about the experimental treatments that offered hope measured in statistical percentages rather than real possibilities. Jake listened without interrupting, his carpenter's hands steady on the park bench between them, while Tommy's laughter provided a soundtrack of innocence to her recitation of medical facts and mortality statistics. When she finished, the silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything she had revealed and everything she still couldn't bring herself to say. "Have you told your father?" Jake asked finally, his voice carefully neutral in the way of someone who understood that family relationships could be complicated beyond easy solutions. Sophia laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made Tommy look up from his duck-feeding expedition with concern. "My father measures success in quarterly profits and stock prices. I'm supposed to be his legacy, his corporate heir. How do I tell him that his investment in my future has an expiration date?" The truth was more complex than Sophia could articulate. Marcus Williams had built his empire around the illusion of control, the belief that money and power could solve any problem and overcome any obstacle. Her diagnosis would represent his first real failure, the first challenge that couldn't be acquisitioned or leveraged or restructured into profitability. She had spent her entire life being the perfect daughter, the ideal corporate successor, and she couldn't bear to see the disappointment in his eyes when he realized she was just another problem his money couldn't fix. Jake understood the burden of protecting people you loved from truths they couldn't handle. He remembered the months after Maria's diagnosis when he had tried to shield Tommy from the full reality of her condition, maintaining the fiction that Mommy would get better while privately researching hospice care and grief counseling for children. The weight of carrying hope for others while managing your own despair was exhausting in ways that people who hadn't experienced it couldn't comprehend. Tommy returned from his duck diplomacy mission with wet hands and a satisfied expression, climbing onto the bench between Jake and Sophia with the casual affection of someone who had decided they were all family now. He leaned against Sophia's side and announced that the Ducks had voted her their second favorite person after him but before Jake, which he explained was a very high honor in the Duck community. These moments of pure connection with Tommy and quiet understanding with Jake became Sophia's refuge from the increasingly complicated demands of her other life. She found herself declining business dinners to spend evenings in Jake's small apartment, helping Tommy with homework, while Jake cooked simple meals that tasted better than anything served in five-star restaurants. She learned to appreciate the luxury of arguing with a 7-year-old about whether vegetables counted as real food, and the satisfaction of reading bedtime stories to someone who believed that books could transport you to other worlds. But while Sophia was discovering what it meant to be part of a real family, Marcus Williams was conducting his own investigation into his daughter's recent behavioral changes. Corporate executives didn't survive in his world without developing sophisticated surveillance instincts, and Sophia's sudden unavailability during evening hours had triggered his natural suspicion of threats to his carefully constructed empire. The private investigator's report landed on Marcus's desk on a Tuesday morning, complete with photographs of Sophia entering a modest apartment building and detailed background checks on Jake Thompson and his son. The file painted a picture that filled Marcus with cold fury and protective rage in equal measure. A working-class single father with no significant assets, no education beyond high school, no connections that could benefit the Williams family interests. To Marcus, the conclusion was as obvious as it was infuriating. His daughter, brilliant and wealthy and beautiful, was being manipulated by an opportunistic mechanic who saw her as his ticket to a better life. The man had probably researched her background, identified her as a target, and engineered their meeting to appear accidental. Marcus had seen this pattern before in the corporate world, where ambitious people with limited resources would target the children of wealthy families, using romance as a pathway to financial security. The photographs of Sophia laughing with Tommy, of Jake's hand on her shoulder as they walked through the park, of the three of them sharing ice cream like an ordinary family, struck Marcus as evidence of calculated manipulation rather than genuine affection. He couldn't conceive of a world where someone might care about his daughter for reasons that had nothing to do with her bank account or her corporate inheritance. Marcus scheduled a meeting with his head of security and his legal team for Thursday afternoon, the same Thursday when Sophia was supposed to be presenting the quarterly pharmaceutical research updates to the board of directors. He had plans to end this inappropriate relationship quickly and permanently, using every tool at his disposal to protect his daughter from what he perceived as a dangerous predator. Meanwhile, Sophia was experiencing her first real taste of unconditional love and struggling with the knowledge that her time to enjoy it was running out. The headaches were getting worse, the dizzy spells more frequent, and she had started having episodes where she would lose several minutes of time, coming back to consciousness with no memory of what had happened. Dr. Henderson had warned her that these were signs of increased pressure in her brain, indicators that the tumor was continuing its aggressive growth despite the experimental treatments. She found herself memorizing moments with Jake and Tommy, storing up conversations and shared laughter like a person preparing for famine. The way Tommy would curl up against her side while they watched movies, his small hand trustingly placed in hers. The way Jake would look at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, his eyes soft with an emotion she was afraid to name because naming it would make losing it even more painful. The approaching confrontation between Sophia's two worlds was inevitable, though none of them realized how close it was or how devastating it would be. Marcus Williams was preparing to use every weapon in his considerable arsenal to destroy what he saw as a threat to his family's security, while Sophia was falling deeper in love with people who saw her as simply human rather than an asset to be protected or acquired. The collision between corporate power and genuine love was coming, and when it arrived, it would test everything that Sophia thought she knew about loyalty, family, and the courage required to choose happiness over security in the face of impossible odds. The summons came on a Thursday morning that had started like any other, with Sophia reviewing pharmaceutical patent applications in her corner office, while fighting off another wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the medication she was secretly taking. Marcus Williams rarely requested meetings with his daughter during business hours, preferring to keep their family relationship separate from corporate operations. So when his assistant called to schedule an immediate conference in the executive boardroom, Sophia knew something significant had shifted in her carefully balanced world. The boardroom occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Williams Industries building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city that stretched to the horizon like a kingdom laid out for inspection. Marcus sat at the head of the polished granite table, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expression carrying the cold calculation that had made him legendary in pharmaceutical circles for his ability to eliminate competition and maximize profit margins. Across from him sat two men Sophia didn't recognize, their expensive suits and briefcases marking them as either lawyers or private investigators, possibly both. The manila folder sitting unopened on the table between them seemed to pulse with menace, and Sophia felt her stomach drop as she realized that whatever was about to happen, it had been planned and orchestrated with the same ruthless efficiency her father brought to hostile corporate takeovers. "Sit down, Sophia," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the tone he reserved for disciplining underperforming executives. "We need to discuss your recent extracurricular activities and their potential impact on this company's reputation and your own safety." The folder was opened with deliberate ceremony, revealing photographs that made Sophia's blood run cold. Images of her laughing with Tommy in Central Park, walking hand in hand with Jake through his neighborhood, sitting in the ice cream parlor with chocolate stains on her designer blouse. Someone had been following her for weeks, documenting every moment of happiness she had found with the Thompson family, turning her most precious memories into evidence of what her father clearly viewed as betrayal. Jake Thompson. Marcus read from the investigative report with the same disgust he might reserve for discussing a particularly virulent strain of bacteria. 32 years old, high school education, employed as an automotive mechanic earning approximately $38,000 annually. Widowed father raising a 7-year-old son in subsidized housing. No significant assets. substantial debt from his deceased wife's medical bills, and now apparently targeting pharmaceutical heiresses for financial gain. The clinical recitation of Jake's life reduced him to a collection of demographic data and economic indicators, stripping away everything that made him the man Sophia had come to love. The way he could make Tommy laugh until milk came out of his nose, his gentle hands that could fix any broken engine or comfort any frightened child, the strength it had taken to rebuild his life after losing his wife, while never allowing his son to feel anything less than completely loved and protected. "This stops now," Marcus continued, closing the folder with finality. "You will have no further contact with this individual or his child. I've already had our legal team draft a cease and desist order, and our security firm has prepared a comprehensive protection plan to ensure he cannot approach you again." Sophia stared at her father across the expanse of granite and realized that she was looking at a stranger. This was the man who had taught her to ride bicycles in the mansion's circular driveway, who had read her bedtime stories about princesses and dragons, who had held her while she cried over scraped knees and broken toys. But somewhere along the way, that loving father had been consumed by the corporate machine he had created, leaving behind only this calculating executive who saw human relationships as potential threats to be eliminated. "You had me followed," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "You hired people to spy on me like I was some kind of corporate asset that might be stolen by competitors." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly in what he probably believed was paternal concern. "I'm protecting you, sweetheart. You're naive about the world outside our circle. This man has clearly researched your background and identified you as a target. Men like him don't befriend women like you out of genuine affection. They see opportunity, financial advancement, access to a lifestyle they could never achieve through honest work." The condescension in his voice, the casual dismissal of Jake's character and integrity, ignited something fierce and protective in Sophia's chest. She thought about Jake working 14-hour days to keep Tommy fed and clothed, about the way he had held her while she cried about her diagnosis without once asking what she could do for him in return, about the gentle strength he had shown in building a loving home from the wreckage of loss and poverty. "You don't know anything about him," Sophia said, her voice rising despite her efforts to maintain control. "Jake Thompson is the most honest, caring, selfless person I've ever met. He doesn't want my money. He doesn't even know about my money. I've never told him about Williams Industries or my trust fund or any of it." One of the men in expensive suits cleared his throat and opened his own briefcase, revealing legal documents that had clearly been prepared in advance. The efficiency of it, the way her father had anticipated every possible argument and prepared counter-arguments, made Sophia realize that this wasn't a discussion but a corporate coup designed to eliminate what Marcus perceived as a threat to his control. "Miss Williams," the lawyer began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to delivering bad news in legally precise language, "we've prepared documentation that will legally prohibit Mr. Thompson from attempting to contact you or approach your residences, workplaces, or known social locations. Any violation of this order will result in immediate criminal charges and civil litigation that will cost him everything he owns." The threat was delivered with businesslike efficiency, but Sophia understood the devastating impact it would have on Jake's life. A restraining order would appear on background checks, potentially costing him his job at the auto shop. Legal battles would drain his limited resources and take time away from caring for Tommy. The Williams legal team could drag him through courts for years, destroying his reputation and his ability to provide for his son. Furthermore, the second lawyer continued, producing additional documents. "We've identified several potential code violations at Morrison's auto shop that could result in immediate closure pending investigation. The owner's business license could be suspended while these matters are resolved, which would unfortunately result in the termination of all current employees." The message was crystal clear. Comply with their demands or watch innocent people suffer the consequences. Marcus had identified everyone in Jake's orbit who could be used as leverage, from his elderly boss to his young son, and prepared to destroy them all if necessary to protect what he saw as his daughter's best interests. Sophia felt the walls of her gilded cage closing around her with suffocating force. The same corporate machinery that had built her family's fortune was now being turned against the people she loved, threatening to crush them beneath the weight of legal fees and professional destruction. She thought about Tommy's gap-toothed smile, about Mrs. Rodriguez's grandmotherly affection, about Jake's calloused hands that had never hurt anyone but had fixed countless broken things. "If you care about this man and his child," Marcus said, his voice gentling in what he probably thought was paternal wisdom, "you'll end this before it goes any further. Let him get back to his own life, his own social class, where he belongs. You'll both be happier in the long run." The assumption that happiness could be legislated along class lines, that love could be regulated like a pharmaceutical compound, revealed everything that was broken about Marcus Williams's worldview. He had spent so many years viewing human relationships through the lens of profit and loss that he had forgotten what it meant to connect with another person without calculating the potential return on investment. Sophia looked around the boardroom that had been designed to intimidate and control, at the lawyers who specialized in destroying lives with legal precision, at her father who had chosen corporate strategy over paternal love. The brain tumor might be killing her, but this room represented a different kind of death, the slow suffocation of everything that made life worth living. "I need time to think," Sophia said finally, her voice barely audible above the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 42 floors below. Marcus nodded with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had won a crucial battle. "Of course, take the weekend. But understand that this situation will be resolved one way or another by Monday morning. Either you end this relationship voluntarily, or we'll be forced to take more aggressive legal action." Sophia left the boardroom feeling like she was walking through water, every step requiring tremendous effort as she navigated hallways that suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Her assistant tried to engage her about afternoon meetings and pending correspondence, but the words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the static of shock and grief. That evening, she sat in her penthouse apartment overlooking the city, staring at her phone while wrestling with an impossible choice. Jake had texted earlier asking if she wanted to join him and Tommy for pizza and a movie, the kind of simple domestic pleasure that had become precious beyond measure. But now, every text felt like evidence in a legal case. Every shared moment, a potential weapon that could be used to destroy the people she was trying to protect. The medication she took for the tumor made thinking difficult, but the situation required clarity that seemed impossible to achieve. Save the people she loved by destroying the relationship that had given her life meaning. Or fight for that love while watching Jake and Tommy suffer the consequences of her father's corporate warfare. At midnight, with tears streaming down her face and her hands shaking from both medication side effects and emotional devastation, Sophia composed the hardest text message she had ever written. The words felt like swallowing glass, each letter a betrayal of everything genuine she had found. "Jake, I can't see you or Tommy anymore. This has to end. Please don't try to contact me. I'm sorry." She hit send before she could change her mind, then turned off her phone and sat in the darkness of her luxurious prison, surrounded by everything money could buy and completely alone with the knowledge that she had just sacrificed the only happiness she had ever known to protect it from destruction. Miles away, in a small apartment above Morrison's auto shop, Jake stared at the message on his phone screen, reading it over and over, while Tommy slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that their carefully constructed family was falling apart. The words seemed so unlike Sophia, so cold and final that he wondered if someone else had written them. But the number was definitely hers, and the message was unambiguous in its finality. He thought about calling her, about driving to her apartment to demand an explanation, but something in the clinical tone of the text warned him that there were forces at work beyond his understanding. Jake had learned enough about grief and loss to recognize when someone was trying to protect him, even if he couldn't understand what they were protecting him from. The next morning, Tommy woke up asking when they would see Miss Sophia again, and Jake found himself explaining that sometimes people had to go away, even when they didn't want to, even when it broke everyone's heart. Tommy listened with the solemn attention of a child who had already learned that the adult world contained inexplicable tragedies, but his questions about why people who loved each other couldn't stay together cut through Jake's defenses like knives. For 3 days, Jake respected Sophia's wishes, while watching his son's cheerful disposition gradually dim like a light with a dying battery. Tommy stopped singing around the apartment, stopped drawing pictures of stick figure families, stopped asking about dinosaur sprinkles and magic healing powers. The absence of Sophia created a hole in their lives that seemed disproportionate to the relatively short time she had been part of their world. On the 4th day, When Tommy asked if Miss Sophia didn't want them anymore because they weren't rich enough to be her real family, something fundamental shifted in Jake's understanding of the situation. This wasn't about love ending or relationships running their course. This was about external forces conspiring to separate people who belonged together. And Jake Thompson had not survived the loss of his wife and rebuilt his life from nothing just to let bureaucrats and lawyers steal what remained of his family's happiness. Jake Thompson had never set foot inside a building worth more than his entire neighborhood, but desperation made unlikely heroes of ordinary men. The Williams Industries lobby gleamed with polished marble and intimidating security guards, designed to make working-class visitors feel small and unwelcome. He carried Tommy's latest drawing in his pocket, a crayon masterpiece depicting 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with family written in purple letters across the top. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to another planet, but Jake's determination burned stronger than his intimidation. When the doors opened to reveal Marcus Williams standing in the hallway as if he had been expecting this confrontation, Jake realized that powerful men and grieving fathers weren't so different after all. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said, his voice carrying corporate authority mixed with paternal protectiveness. "I thought you might eventually show up here. Security is already on their way." Jake pulled out Tommy's drawing and held it steady despite his trembling hands. "Your daughter is dying, Mr. Williams. She told me about the brain tumor, about having 18 months to live. She's spending whatever time she has left alone because she's trying to protect us from you." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each syllable dismantling his carefully constructed narrative about gold-digging mechanics and corporate threats. Sophia hadn't told him about her diagnosis, hadn't trusted him with the most devastating news of her life, and suddenly her recent behavior made terrible sense. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered, but his voice cracked with the sound of a father's worst fears being confirmed. "She would have told me. The best doctors, the finest hospitals, money is no object." Jake stepped closer, his work boots silent on the executive carpet. "She didn't tell you because she knew you'd turn it into another business problem to solve. But some things can't be bought or leveraged or restructured. Sometimes all you can do is love someone while you have them." Tommy burst from the elevator where Jake had told him to wait, his 7-year-old patience exhausted by adult conversations he couldn't understand. He ran straight to Marcus, grabbing the shocked CEO's expensive suit jacket with sticky fingers that smelled like the peanut butter sandwich he'd eaten for courage. "Are you Sophia's daddy?" Tommy demanded with the directness that only children possessed. "She cries about you all the time. She says you don't love her anymore because she's broken, but Dad says being broken doesn't make you less lovable. It just makes you need more hugs." Marcus Williams, who had commanded boardrooms and intimidated competitors for 3 decades, found himself kneeling on his office floor, being lectured about love by a child in mismatched socks. Tommy's innocent words shattered the last of his corporate defenses, leaving only a terrified father who had been too afraid of his own helplessness to comfort his dying daughter. "Where is she?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "Where is Sophia?" They found her in the hospital parking lot where everything had begun, sitting in her Mercedes with her head against the steering wheel, too weak from the latest round of experimental treatment to drive herself home. The tumor had progressed faster than the doctors predicted, stealing pieces of her coordination and memory with ruthless efficiency. When Sophia saw the 3 most important men in her life approaching her car together, she thought the medication was causing hallucinations. Her father, still in his corporate suit but with tears streaming down his face. Jake, carrying flowers he'd probably bought from the hospital gift shop. Tommy, bouncing with excitement, despite the gravity of the situation. "I'm sorry," Marcus said as he opened her car door, his voice breaking on the words he'd forgotten how to say. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I was so afraid of losing you that I almost lost you anyway." Jake knelt beside her seat, taking her trembling hands in his steady ones. "We're not going anywhere, Sophia. Whatever time we have, we're going to spend it together. All of us." Tommy climbed into the back seat and wrapped his small arms around Sophia's shoulders from behind. "Dad says when people are really sick, they need extra love to help them fight. I have lots of extra love. More than I know what to do with." 6 months later, Sophia Williams Thompson sat in a wheelchair decorated with flowers and ribbons, wearing her mother's wedding dress and the brightest smile anyone had seen in years. The ceremony took place in the hospital chapel, where she was receiving palliative care, surrounded by the unlikely family that had chosen each other against impossible odds. Marcus walked her down the aisle with tears of pride rather than sorrow, having learned that love multiplied rather than divided when shared freely. He had stepped back from corporate operations to spend every possible moment with his daughter, discovering that her laughter was worth more than any quarterly profit margin. Jake's vows were simple and devastating. "Sophia, you taught me that love isn't about how much time you have together, but about how deeply you choose to live in whatever time you're given. Every day with you is a gift I never thought I deserved." Tommy served as ring-bearer with the seriousness of someone entrusted with the most important job in the world, and during the reception, he announced to everyone that he now had the best mom in the universe, even if she came with wheels. Sophia died 8 months later, surrounded by her chosen family in a bedroom filled with Tommy's artwork and Jake's woodworking projects, and Marcus's awkward but heartfelt attempts to be the father she had always needed. Her last words were a whispered thank you to the universe for giving her just enough time to learn what love really meant. At her funeral, Tommy stood between his father and grandfather, holding both their hands while they grieved the woman who had taught them all that families weren't born, they were built. One act of kindness at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.